Hey guys, in this AI dictionary video, we're going to be learning about MCP. MCP. Now, MCP stands for Model Context Protocol. Model Context Protocol. And it's one of the early protocols that we have in the AI space right now, especially for developing AI agents. It's one of the very first highly adopted standards that we have in the AI space, especially, like I said, when it comes to developing AI agents. Now, one question I like asking about any new technology that comes to the space, it doesn't matter whether it's AI or DevOps or any field, any technology field that I'm looking into, is why. Why do we need this protocol? Or why do we need this technology? Why do we need this tool? Now, for MCP, we're going to start by discussing the why. Why do we need MCP? Now, first, let's have a little timeline here. So first we started with LLMs. LLMs were the rave and everybody loved LLMs. ChatGPT brought about a whole paradigm shift to the way we interact with technology. Then, we got bored with that. We wanted more, as we always do as humans. So we discovered tool calling. Tool calling. Now, tool calling allows us to extend our LLMs beyond just chatbots, beyond just prompt response cycles, beyond just this chatty technology. So then came about tool calling. Now, tool calling allows us to make real-world impact. Or should I say it allows LLMs to make real-world impact. So instead of just having questions and answers, you can actually tell an LLM to send an email. You can tell it to send an email. You can tell it to send a Slack message. And you can even tell it to read from a database and draw records from a database and all sorts. So that was game changing. That was very, very huge. And it was what led to the creation of agents. It was what led to the emergence of AI agents. And AI agents are everywhere now. Everyone wants to build AI agents because they kind of feel like the real value that AI models can bring to our real world. Instead of just, like I said, being these oracles of knowledge that we just consult for information. So tool calling came, but then there is a problem with tool calling. There was a problem with tool calling, and that is the problem of standardization. So you want to call MySQL, everybody had their own strategy for calling MySQL. You want to call Google Drive, everybody is developing their own strategy around the tool calling technology for calling these services. So obviously that's going to become messy. And one implementation will always vary from the other. And even the way each LLM provider implements tool calling from their APIs were different. So you can imagine the whole chaos that was becoming. So Anthropic, the guys at Anthropic, decided to gift the world MCP. MCP, Model Context Protocol. Model Context Protocol. So that was what brought about Model Context Protocol. Because of the chaos that was going on with tool calling, people having to tweak prompts. One set of prompts is different from another set of prompts for interacting with the same technology. So yeah, we weren't going to have that. And Anthropic took that personally, and they gave us Model Context Protocol, which is a standard that is meant to, no pun intended, standardize the way that we interact with external services, the way LLMs interact with external services, since tool calling and making real-world actions, taking real-world actions is going to become a very big part of developing AI agents. So now that we understand what MCP has come to do, the purpose of MCP, let's take a look at how it works. Now, MCP is a simple protocol that uses a client-server model. So let's say these are our clients, and let's just put another box here and call it our server. So we have a client, and we have a server. So our client runs the MCP protocol and is able to communicate with these things called MCP servers. But it's a bit more organized than that. So let us look at the different parts of MCP so that we can really understand how it works. The first part of MCP is the service provider. So we have the service provider. So your service providers are things like Slack, Discord, and the likes. They are the services you want to communicate with. They are the services that you want to use to take your real-world actions. You want to send an email, you communicate with an email server. Any service that you want to connect to, that is your service provider. So We then have an MCP server. An MCP server. The job of the MCP server, let me change this to MCP server. Say MCP server. So the job of the MCP server is to interface with your service provider. Just interface with your service provider. So the service providers are basically the ones that provide these MCP servers, and it contains prompts. It can contain standard prompts. It contains resources that you might want to access. And it also consists of tools that you can use on the service provider. Tools that have been exposed by the service provider, resources on the service, or resources that the service provider can make available to you, and standard prompts for interacting with the service provider. So those are the three things that you can find on an MCP server. So we have the MCP server, which is going to be provided by the service provider and is going to interface with the service provider. And then we have your MCP hosts. Or rather, let me put this here. We have an MCP host. Now, your MCP host is the application that has an MCP client installed on it. An MCP client is installed on it. So you have your, let me give this a color. Yeah. So you have your MCP host, which has an MCP client installed on it. So the MCP client is basically a piece of software that makes the connection to the MCP server. It just runs, it can run in the background, it can run in the foreground. It's just the piece of software that makes the connection. Your MCP host is the application that actually hosts the MCP client. For example, the Cursor IDE, the Cursor AI IDE, it's an MCP host. It's an MCP host because it contains an MCP client. That's why you can add MCP servers to it to call, so that you can call those MCP servers. You also have, the Cloud Code also has runs an MCP client, and even you can have an MCP client running within your AI agents, and they allow you programmatically to interface with MCP servers and be able to use them. So these are the four different parts of MCP. Yeah? So we have the MCP host, whose job is to host the MCP client. The job of the MCP client is to make connections, is to make requests to the MCP server. That's the job of the MCP client, to make requests to the MCP server. The job of the MCP server is to interface with the service provider that contains the actual service that you want to use or you want to take actions through. And on MCP servers, you can find prompts, you can find resources, and you can find tools to interact with. So those are the standard parts of the whole MCP protocol. Those are the four standard parts of the entire MCP protocol. Now, how does MCP work? That's what we're going to use to wrap up this dictionary video. Now, how does MCP work? So first, let's say you want to send an email. Let's use that example. Let's say you want to send an email. So your MCP host is the application that you're using to decide whether you want to take your actions, the application where your LLM actually lives on, and your LLM takes a request from the user and goes through the request and realizes that it needs to send an email. So you realize that it needs to send an email. So what does it do? It calls the MCP client. The MCP host calls the MCP client, and the MCP client looks through the list of registered MCP servers on the host. It looks at the MCP clients that are registered on the host, and it finds, let's say, a SendGrid MCP server. SendGrid is the standard tool for sending emails. So he finds a SendGrid MCP server. So he then calls the SendGrid MCP server. He makes a request to the SendGrid MCP server, and the SendGrid MCP server will respond with all the resources it has. It will return with prompts, it will return with tools, it will return with resources. So the MCP client then looks through the returned tools, and let's say he finds a send email function. It will recognize that, yeah, this is the function I need to send an email. So it will then take the function, extract details from the prompt that was sent by the user, and it will then call the function through the MCP server. The MCP server will then call the service provider to send the email. Once the email is sent, the service provider returns to the MCP server to confirm that the email is sent, and the MCP server returns to the MCP client to give it the success response. And your action is complete. Your action is complete. So that's how MCP works. Model Context Protocol is basically a protocol that is meant to provide tools and context to your AI models. And that is MCP.